This is Sovereign Debt, a podcast on greening the global economy and debt sustainability. I'm your host, Jill Doshi. We are delighted to have here today Jen Morris as our guest. Jen is the CEO of the Nature Conservancy, which, if you don't know, is a huge environmental organization with over 3,500 staff active over 70 countries. Their mission is to conserve land and water globally and address the crises of biodiversity loss and climate change. They've been thought leaders not only on the science of conservation, with over 400 scientists on staff, but also through their impact finance group, NatureVest. Jen is here to share with us her thoughts on COP26 and their recent trailblazing deal in Belize. Jen, thank you so much for agreeing to come in and to be on our podcast. We have a lot of ground to cover. I don't even know where to begin. But before we get into all of the COP26, I really wanted to just hear a little bit about your story. Because before you came to the helm of TNC, you were at Conservation International. And then you came to TNC right at the moment, if I remember correctly, at the beginning of the pandemic, when everyone was in lockdown. What was that like coming to into a global organization, and you're a person who travels even more than I do, and suddenly you're in lockdown and having to lead through this really incredible period?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, Jill, thanks so much for having me on. It's wonderful to be here. And I love what you're doing with this podcast. It's really exciting to see. So, yeah, you can imagine it was quite a transition to go from being out and about at my job at Conservation International as president there before I came to Nature Conservancy. I joined at the basically middle of May of 2020. So just a year and a half ago, and right in the middle of not being able to travel. And so, being in a situation as a new CEO with 4,500 employees in 75 different countries and not being able to really see anybody face to face was quite rough. I mean, there were some good things, I would say, in the sense that I was able to, be a mile wide and an inch deep and kind of talk to India in the morning and Indiana in the afternoon and Seattle in the evening. And that was helpful to really just learn as part of my initial onboarding to kind of touch down by Zoom and meet people, but clearly not having the opportunity to be face to face, especially with my senior management team for quite some time, was challenging. And of course, we were dealing with a lot as a nonprofit organization, looking at potentially seeing a reduction in revenues. And so we decided to cut our budget by 20%. We had some very unfortunate reductions in staff just to prepare for what we thought would be a very, very difficult financial time. And looking back, we were wrong financially. Certainly we were, just like many other nonprofit organizations. I think as people had a little bit more disposable income, they saw the connections between nature and health and COVID and kind of our broken relationship as human society with nature. We saw record investments. So we were very fortunate to see that, but surely it's been difficult and continues to be difficult for many of our teams in the field, both here in the US, but then of course in the many countries where we're working. So we're not out of the woods yet.
Let me first, before we get into too much, I want to just go back to the basics of nature. A lot of our audience are not necessarily conservationists or conservation minded even necessarily. Many are debt managers and economists and kind of finance types that maybe have not really thought about some of these linkages that you were just saying about nature and the virus and things. And generally speaking, everyone is kind of making the connections between climate change and its effects and things. But where does nature fit into this? And why are the experts always talking about climate and nature? I mean, for those of us kind of outside of this business, isn't that just the same thing?
Yeah, so great question, Jill. And it's fantastic to be able to share what is often the forgotten solution to climate change. I will say it has been the forgotten solution perhaps until COP, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, I believe. But nature is critical for climate change. And the best science on this tells us that 30%, actually a little bit more than 30% of the solution for the climate crisis comes from restoring and protecting nature. Now, the reverse of that, just to put it in very, very plain terms for the audience, is that if we all went 100% fossil fuel free tomorrow, from our buildings to what we drive to everything, and we don't address the loss of nature, specifically deforestation and degradation of tropical forests, mangroves, and peat systems around the world and boreal systems, if we didn't do anything about that, we would never achieve the goals under Paris, the 1.5 degree max threshold under Paris, the Paris targets. So this idea, and look, we're seeing incredible progress in energy. It needs to go faster. We're all very disappointed that coal, the language around phasing out of coal was removed in the 11th hour at COP. But the reality is we're moving along the right trajectory when it comes to the energy solution. We're moving more towards renewable. We know that natural gas is very competitive. Natural gas and, of course, even more renewable sources such as solar and wind are becoming, if not already in many places, cost competitive with fossil fuels. So we're moving in the right direction from a market perspective. But where we lack those market and thus scalable solutions is really in nature. And we have got to change the way that we produce, in particular agriculture, which agricultural impacts are responsible for about 80% of the forest conversion and the loss of nature globally. So we have to find this balance of producing enough food, reducing waste of food, which is a huge contributor to why we are using so much land because of the waste component, and ensuring that we provide enough food and enough fuel and fiber for the growing human population. But we have to remember that connection between biodiversity and climate change. And those two things together are really the front and center of the ethos of the Nature Conservancy, is that every dollar that comes into this institution, we want to make sure we're able to tackle, ideally, both of those things simultaneously to have the highest return on every dollar that we raise from very important donors. So that's kind of why nature is so critical for the climate solution. So we've got to flip the script on this, Jill. We've got to change the way we think about nature and make sure that it's included every time we're talking about the climate crisis.
Is it just because we need the forests and to suck up the carbon, to just put it really bluntly?
No, it's actually more than that. So if you don't have a healthy forest, if you don't have pollinators, if you don't have dispersers, so if you don't have birds and all the different small mammals that actually keep a forest healthy. So they spread the seeds, they make sure that the trees reproduce, that you're getting the right type of ecosystem balance. If you don't have those plants and animals and a diversity of those plants and animals, because nature has been perfecting ecological systems on this planet for millions of years. And humans, many scientists call this the age of the Anthropocene, when humans are actually completely undermining the natural ecological systems that have kept the climate in balance. So biodiversity is a critical component of that, because if you just kept trees standing, yes, they would still suck up carbon, but ultimately those trees would be empty forests, and ultimately they would slowly die because they don't have the ecological infrastructure to keep those trees and those forests healthy and thriving. So we need both. So biodiversity is a critical component of the climate solution as well. And we often have put them in two separate camps, because often the scientists are either climate scientists or they're biologists. And now I think you're seeing a real difference in the way the dialogue, after decades of pushing from organizations like the Nature Conservancy, Conservation International, World Wildlife Fund, all of these big organizations are now pushing this concept of the integration, the critical integration of nature and biodiversity to help not only preserve healthy ecosystems, which we know are so important, but also for climate regulation.
Gotcha. Okay, no, so that makes sense. So governments who are just trying to do the good thing and are just trying to say, okay, we're going to plant trees, we're going to plant X million or whatever trees. That's not necessarily enough, right?
Exactly. So there are wonderful efforts worldwide by companies and governments to plant trillions of trees. And you hear about the Trillion Tree Initiative, the billions of trees that many companies are claiming that they're going to be planting. And that's fantastic. It's great. We need restoration of ecosystems. But it's not just about tree planting. Number one, you got to make sure that those trees survive. And when anybody tells you they're doing a tree planting project, the first question you should always ask is, what is your survival rate? Number one. Number two, what kind of trees and where? And it's really critical that you're not just planting, obviously a fast growing species that maybe isn't from there, but you're planting local trees that were originally in that ecosystem, in addition to perhaps fast growing species, which may be used for fiber or fuel for local communities, especially in places like Africa. So you need a mix, but you need to make sure you're using ecologists when you're thinking about tree planting. You can't just go out and plant a bunch of trees and expect to have a climate benefit. It just doesn't work.
And I guess the best thing would be just don't cut the trees down in the first place, right?
Correct. It's much, much cheaper to save what we already have than to restore what we've lost. And so we've lost so much already. So we need to be restoring that. And TNC and many organizations are involved in restoring degraded lands throughout the developing and the developed world, quite frankly, through tree planting and really bringing life back to land and soils. But yes, you're absolutely correct. Protecting what we have now before we lose it is much more economically astute, as well as the trees that are there, the forest, the tropical forest, the mangroves, the peats, some of that we can't ever get back if we lose. So in fact, CI and TNC and some other organizations just published a paper this week on what's called irrecoverable carbon. So if we lose certain forests, like in the Congo Basin or the boreal region of Canada, we lose those forests, they won't be recoverable. We can't replant our way back to healthy carbon in those ecosystems because they're so dense and they're so important. You can't ever just plant back trees that can be comparable to what those original ecosystems are. So that's a really important thing that you just mentioned.
When we're hearing all of this about climate and nature and biodiversity and all of that, but what about the people? It's, as you know, I work with a lot of low and middle income countries, a lot of developing countries. I have very tight budgets, very little fiscal space. They're trying to allocate resources as best they can. But, the development needs for the population are so great. Why should they divert precious resources to protecting, nature and addressing climate change?
That's a fundamental question. And I love that you asked me that. So first and foremost, let's start globally. So a recent study by the World Economic Forum last year demonstrated, through looking at all the ecological services that nature provides, that 50% of global GDP is reliant upon intact nature. So that means that preservation of water that we need for agriculture, for household use, for pollinators that make sure that a lot of our plants are germinating, fruit trees are thriving, ecosystems are healthy, that if we lose that, we lose jobs. And, as you hear many labor activists say, there are no jobs on a dead planet. And so the connection between healthy nature and people is first and foremost. Now, if you're a leader of a government that's struggling to provide education and hospitals, especially to recover from COVID, it is 100% understandable that you're going to put your resources to that first. However, the fundamental framework of a healthy society really is also about intact nature. And we're seeing that everywhere. When we lose our ecosystems, when we degrade our ecosystems, when we are growing crops on slopes without proper fixation from trees, for example, you see mudslides and things that countries are having to recover from and spend so much of their precious capital on relief, instead of looking at the preservation of nature as preventative care, as helping people and providing for jobs through renewable energy transition, through other types of transitions that are needed through tree planting and many other job creation opportunities that can happen through the transition of our economies to incorporate nature. I mean, look, nature has been giving us a free lunch forever. And she is no longer able to provide that free lunch. We have reached a tipping point on our planet where if we don't invest back, both in urban environments and rural environments, and then every single finance minister in every single country around the world can actually understand and value what previously has been, as economists say, an externality, but actually internalize the external value of nature to our economies, then my concern and many others in this field are that we're going to constantly be just funding relief instead of taking the appropriate measures now to shore us up for what is coming, which is already here in many places. And those countries with the least ability to repair their ecosystems and be resilient from the climate crisis are the ones that are going to be most impacted. And that's what we need to change, is really thinking about natural capital and the values of nature in a very, very different way.
Well, that's actually a perfect segue into my next question, which is turning, in fact, to COP26. Sorry, I wasn't going to let you off the hook. We were going to have to talk about it.
I would expect nothing less, Joe.
Exactly. So COP26, I mean, so basically on the planet, we've got all of these developing countries. They're still struggling with COVID. Many still don't even have vaccines. They have little fiscal space. Many were already in debt distress, even pre-pandemic. And at the same time, we as humanity need those countries to be investing in, as you say, kind of preventative measures for climate and nature. But they just don't have the resources. They also have maybe either no credit rating or a low credit rating. They're riskier places. They don't necessarily attract all of the international capital. And yet at the same time, we have all of this international capital, maybe in the global north, kind of roughly speaking. How can we mobilize that into where we need it to go? What are the roles of donors and governments and organizations like yourselves? What was being talked about at COP26? I mean, we heard this kind of goal of the 100 billion. Is there any hope? Was there progress made?
Yes and no. So I would say that there was progress made on a few fronts, and I'll just mention a few, and then of course we can talk about what didn't get done, which I'm sure many of your listeners know. But what gave me hope was the fact that for the first time first and foremost, we had finance ministers, heads of state talking about the important role of nature. So back to the conversation we just had, we're slowly getting there. We're seeing that now people are starting to understand the value. So that's great. But as you say, how do we have the financing to actually invest in preventative care? And one of the things that is very important that is often not talked about, which was talked about at COP for the first time that I've been involved, was the role of bad subsidies. So of subsidies for fossil fuel industry, of subsidies for agriculture that destroys instead of restores the planet. And for the first time, there's real concerted efforts, not only to push governments to have targets around redirecting those negative subsidies, but also to have financing schemes which help. Let's take agriculture, which is something that was talked about a lot at COP. And again, in my mind, more than ever before, to redirect and to help to ensure that farmers have the right types of financing they need to invest in measures that will help them move to, say, regenerative agriculture that doesn't undermine the soil health and that actually restores on-farm and off-farm forests and other types of ecosystems. So we see time and time again at the Nature Conservancy, whether it's in Brazil or in Kenya, that farmers generally would love to protect their soil. And they're often, people are, of course, as farmers, very tied to the land, and they're seeing what's happening to their land and becoming more degraded, but they just don't have the financial resources. So we launched one initiative in Brazil called IFAC, the Innovative Finance for the Amazon, Cerrado, and the Chaco, which has a goal working with financial institutions and big supply chain leaders in the soy, beef space in particular, and corn as well, to invest in the agricultural transition in a way that works for farmers. So patient capital, that can be used for providing inputs that will slowly move those farmers into a more regenerative system. So that the goal is 10 billion for that. We raised already $3 billion for this. So we're starting to see scale, and we're starting to see mainstream, both agricultural banks as well as commercial banks, realize that this is important. Their shareholders are demanding it, and certainly farmers need it. And we're never going to achieve the Glasgow Declaration on land use and on forest and land use, which basically calls for an end of deforestation in supply chains by 2030. We're never going to achieve that unless we change the way we provide financing to farmers so that it is restorative and not destructive. That's critical, and that was something that was very exciting.
Awesome. When you're not in the green zone as you were, and you're just kind of hearing all of the announcements coming out, it's nice to hear that there was something positive coming out.
Absolutely. But I will also say that, there were some things that were not as positive. And that is, of course, I'm sure as your listeners have followed the news on this, but we still don't have the ambitions we need. And of course, Paris is just voluntary. So these are commitments. These are not necessarily what all countries are going to do, but we did not have the ambition, at least on the voluntary commitments, to get us to that 1.5 degree threshold. We're still above that. And there's a great website called the Carbon Tracker, which really helps Carbon Action Tracker, which you can actually look at the commitments by each country and where in the aggregate they put us as a global society to that 1.5 degree threshold. So we're not there. And in particular, the 11th hour change in the coal language was definitely upsetting to many, many, many people. The good news, however, is that we finally got the Paris rule book around carbon markets after about a decade has finally been agreed to. So that will provide some assurances to the markets, the carbon markets, which enable us to scale and really investing in ecosystems. So and Indigenous people, I'd say the other bright spot was that Indigenous people, for the first time, I would say, have a real seat at the table, and that there was actual specific language inserted about the role of Indigenous people and how governments, countries, as well as companies need to be working with Indigenous people when it comes to climate change. So those were all positives, but it was a mixed bag, to be sure.
Mm-hmm. Both in the green zone, when you're in the green zone, and just generally. I mean, you're in contact with the leaders of governments, the major, wealthiest and most influential philanthropists, other institutions. I mean, the list goes on, the corporations, the banks. Do you feel a mood changing? Do you feel a commitment to these issues? I mean, a real commitment rather than just kind of fancy announcements and commitments, as you say.
I would say it's mixed. I would say that, the private sector, in particular, some of the bigger companies on the planet have been stepping up for the last 5 years, and they're the model. The CEO declarations, whether it's on deforestation or getting to zero or net zero by 2050, those are all fantastic.
And you feel that's real, or is it just for their shareholders and kind of their share price, just greenwashing?
I think some are actually real. I do. And I think the ones that are setting more immediate short-term targets and are using the whole science-based target approach, I think those companies, and because their employees and their shareholders are going to hold them responsible. And increasingly we're seeing employees, especially young employees, and given how tight the labor markets are for talent, they have choices of where they're going to work, and they want to work for a value-driven company. And if those company CEOs don't make good on these commitments, they're going to walk. So I think increasingly we're seeing C-suite professionals really take these seriously, and they're not just window dressing. That being said, there's some of that, of course. I mean, I don't think any of us are naive after years of fighting this fight to believe that some companies aren't just doing it to check an ESG box and move on and tell their shareholders doing great things and aren't really making the tough changes needed. I mean, I think we're seeing that from some of the oil and gas sector companies are not doing what they need to do to get us to zero. We're seeing, new licenses that they're pursuing for offshore drilling. We need to stop that. We need to actually move. And I recognize, I think we also have to be realistic about what it's going to take to have the full energy transition and agricultural transition. It's definitely not something that can happen overnight. But we all as citizens, every single person on this planet has got to be pushing our leaders who have the ability to influence change to make that change faster. Or otherwise, we're going to spend all of our talent and treasure, Jill, just dealing with the weather. And no one wants to do that. We want to be building and innovating and doing amazing things as a society. But if we don't change faster, we're going to constantly be dealing with the next storm, the next crisis, the next flood, the next drought, refugees, et cetera. So the time is now. We do not have any time to wait. And so anyone who is doing window dressing, I think is going to be a company that's not going to do well in the future, for sure.
I couldn't agree more. And I want to transition actually to one thing that TNC has done recently that was really, taking action, and that's the Belize transaction. I mean, you and I both know that Potomac Group was involved, but I want to hear it from in your words.
Absolutely, yes. So thanks for asking. So yes, this was really exciting. It was a lot of work on just by an incredible group of people and partners from certainly the government of Belize being in the lead, with the Nature Conservancy, Credit Suisse, and the Development Finance Corporation were the final players in the deal. But lots of organizations, including the Potomac Group, have provided input into this over the last 2 years or so. And the basic idea is simple. So the government of Belize, coming out of COVID, was highly indebted, and relied so much on tourism. And when tourism dried up, really had very little way to service their debt. And so, recognizing that Belize sits on the Mesoamerican reef, which is the second largest reef in the world, and is very, very important reef from a biodiversity and a marine conservation perspective. Belize, within Belizean territories, is about 30% of that Mesoamerican reef. So the idea was that you have a high biodiversity country it's also highly indebted. And could we not structure a deal with the bondholders where we were able to refinance the debt of Belize, which in this particular transaction was, we took about $533 million of their debt and refinanced it to enable about $180 million to go directly into marine conservation, which was a tripling of the marine conservation budget. And in exchange, the government of Belize agreed to protect 30% of its exclusive economic zone, its marine territory. 30% of that would be protected using scientific methods for understanding which parts are highly, highly protected and which parts could be open for some limited fishing, as well as, of course, for tourism. And so we negotiated that with Belize. They were thrilled. We announced it at the Conference of Parties in Glasgow. And I must say, to your question about are we going to do more? Yes, this is a replication of our Seychelles deal about 5 years ago, which was phenomenal, but we didn't do another one. We had expected to roll these off every single year, a couple a year. And I think we learned a lot from the Seychelles transaction, which we were able to implement in the Belize transaction. And now we are, of course, other governments have been coming to us, as you can imagine, saying, this is amazing. We want to do that too. How do we do it? Let's talk. And so I think that everyone listening who is interested in this whole area, please feel free to reach out. We had an incredible team in our Nature Vest group who really helped to structure it, as well as with, as I mentioned, Credit Suisse and the Development Finance Corporation. Just a phenomenal partnership. And it really is it's a win-win for nature and for the government of Belize.
No, it was a fantastic transaction. And I know that loads of both governments in a variety of countries are looking to it. And like you said, kind of very interested to say, when's my turn? How do I do this? So the question is, how do they do it? I mean, do they just send you an email?
We have gotten emails actually. And,
okay.
It all starts with the obviously conversation and clearly working with experts like you and Potomac Group and others that can help us think through, okay, what debt do they have? What's the debt trading at? Is it even possible? And really for us, is the government committed to a big conservation win? Because we're not going to, we're a conservation organization. So at the end of the day, we wouldn't just engage in a transaction that didn't lead to very significant marine or terrestrial conservation benefits that, would also help the country long term from a tourism and a natural capital preservation perspective. So yes, so if there's government will to increase their protection and also debt that makes sense, you're welcome to get in touch with us, get in touch with the Potomac Group, and certainly would be interested to have that conversation. And I think it's very relevant for a lot of island nations in particular. We have a marine lens for a lot of our work in this space on debt restructuring, but certainly we're open to terrestrial transactions.
I was just going to ask, because so far it's been very marine concentrated, or at least the Seychelles and Belize was. Do you have ambitions to do it, for other purposes beyond marine conservation?
We do. In fact, we're sort of, because we are getting requests from other organizations, and because I will mention there's a big movement around something called 30 by 30, or 30% protection of the planet by 2030. And so a lot of governments have put their hands up to do this, but yet they lack the financial resources to make it happen. So from a terrestrial perspective, yes, we're talking to several countries now that are interested in a big terrestrial investment in exchange for a debt for nature type transaction. So yes, terrestrial and marine are absolutely possible.
Does TNC have the capacity to do a ton of these, or do you envision partnering with other organizations or governments?
Yeah, so I think that it's quite scalable, but we do have capacity. We've built an amazing team in our NatureVest group, but we also know that there's a lot of other organizations that are interested in doing this and have the capacity. And so we certainly want to share the lessons that we've learned and support groups like Potomac Group, as well as, of course, the World Bank and the IMF are discussing and looking at this, and as are other environmental NGOs. So we certainly support all of those efforts, because whenever this tool can be used to help governments reduce their overall indebtedness as well as invest in conservation, that's a win for all of us. And so, yes, TNC has capacity, but we want everybody to be active when they have the capacity to do these deals.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jen, for being with us today.
Thank you, Jill. It's wonderful to be with you.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, leave us a review and subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts.